Well, hello everyone. And by everyone, I hope that I'm not being unduly optimistic. My name is Peter Bowler, and the name of this podcast is Pete's Profundities and Profanities. Whilst hope springs eternal in aspiring for the former, I have no real intention of descending into the latter. I just thought it might be a mildly amusing and alliterative title. My intention is to discuss a variety of those topics of which I have an interest and hopefully a little knowledge, accepting that a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. And in so doing, perhaps bring a new and slightly different perspective to them. I must also make it clear that any opinions ventured within this podcast are purely and solely my own, unless, of course, I'm quoting. Today, I'm going to put forward something which I have called the blank canvas theory, and how this applies to popular music since the turn of the 19th century up until today. Before commencing in earnest, I'll just slightly qualify this by conceding that by its very nature, this is an inexact science, which does not claim to be comprehensive, definitive, or exhaustive. I must also concede that there are multiple and disparate cultural and technological phenomena which have also contributed to changing the musical landscape. At the same time, I do not believe that these in themselves invalidate the basic premise of what it is I'm proposing to put forward. So to move on and get to the crux of the matter, this theory I am putting forward is broadly based upon the contention that popular music, or at least that since the turn of the 19th century, can be identified and categorized within a particular broad heading, which, I suggest, has a finite lifetime of mainstream predominance. This lifeline is determined by the completion, saturation, exhaustion, or near as damn it, of a theoretical blank canvas, which upon this occurring is succeeded and superseded by another predominating mainstream form of popular music. This will in turn commence and start virtually afresh with its own blank canvas, upon which artists, songwriters, musicians will add their own imprint, until this too comes to a point of virtual exhaustion and a new one emerges to supplant it and take its place. To make clear what I mean by completion, saturation, exhaustion, is that over the passage of time, numerous artists will leave their own creative input thereon, and there will, almost inevitably I suggest, come a time which I estimate to be 30 years or thereabouts, when there is virtually no space or scope remaining on the canvas for any further genuinely novel and original musical creativity. As such, and when this point is reached, my contention is that the scope for anything truly original is so limited that the great majority of what follows and emerges is at best derivative and formulaic, and at worst neo-plagiaristic. If we were to go back to the turn of the 19th century, and to be clear, I'm talking primarily here about the UK and the USA, then we would find that the predominating forms of mainstream popular music were music hall in the UK and vaudeville in the USA. There may also be an argument for the jazz age during the 1920s, but more about that later. These were to remain the predominant forms of popular mainstream music until, I would suggest, some point in the late 1920s, and as a pivotal year, I would give you 1927, which saw the release of the first talkie, The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson. To all intents and purposes, this effectively sounded the death knell for music hall and vaudeville, and their subsequent superseding and supplanting as a predominant mainstream music form by what was to become known as the Great American Songbook. The period covering the Great American Songbook was, of course, dominated by a golden age of songwriters such as Irving Berlin, Jerome Kern, George and Ira Gershwin, Duke Ellington, to name but a few, and artists such as Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, Judy Garland, Nat King Cole, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, etc., etc., all of whom left their own indelible imprint upon its at first virtually pristine canvas. As with music hall and vaudeville before it, during the course of the First World War, the Great American Songbook was itself the soundtrack to the Second World War. This would continue to be the case until its own virtually pristine blank canvas had in turn been exhausted and the listening public were once again ready for something new and quite different. Before I leave the Great American Songbook completely and move on to what it was that would replace it, I thought I would take the opportunity just to throw out a few recommendations for anyone who might be mildly interested. Firstly, I would point you in the direction of Ella Fitzgerald and her series of seminal albums covering the period and the genre. Next, I would mention the inimitable Harry Nilsson and his A Little Touch of Schmilsson in the Night, with arrangements by Gordon Jenkins, who had previously done the same for the great Nat King Cole. Finally, and to my mind, the Great American Songbook to end all Great American Songbook albums, Willie Nelson's 1978 masterpiece, Stardust. This has the most wonderful Booker T. Jones arrangements and is, in my opinion, a magnificently understated, and all the better for that, triumph. To end on a somewhat contentious note, I would advise avoiding, like the proverbial plague, a certain Rod Stewart's efforts in that direction, which in my opinion bring new meaning to the words anodyne and mediocre. For fear of going off on a tangent, I must admit that this may be slightly coloured by Sir Roderick and I going our separate ways around 1973. His loss, I'm sure. As to the reasons for this estrangement, I can do no more than quote and echo the words of the distinguished music journalist Greil Marcus when he wrote the following in Rolling Stone in 1978. Rarely has a singer held as full and unique a talent as Rod Stewart. Rarely has anyone betrayed that talent so completely. Once the most compassionate presence in music, he has become a bilious self-parody, and then, almost as an afterthought, and sells more records than ever. So, on that slightly controversial note, I'll love you and leave you. Next time that I join you, or you join me, whichever way round that should be, I'll be talking about the demise, or at least the completion of its canvas, of the Great American Songbook, and what would come to replace it after something of a false dawn. Until then, thank you for listening to Pete's Profundities and Profanities, and as the great Dave Allen used to sign off with, may your God go with you, and please take good care of you and yours. Bye for now.